Welcome to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How we consume it and how it informs our everyday culture.
I'm Christian Sager, a writer and a designer.
And I'm Charlie Bennett, a librarian and a radio raconteur.
Each episode is us trying to understand the entertainment world that we all live in.
Just a little bit better.
Today's episode is about Batman Odyssey.
Holy shit.
This comic book series by Neal Adams is a strange combination of talent and narcissism, with the realization that its lead character and its creator aren't as in control as they would like to be. We discuss gun violence, expanding Earth theory, and generational conflict, all to try to make sense of this one-of-a-kind experience.
You can find our show notes at patreon.com/supercontext, and you can write us an email. Did you read this? Are you going to read it? What do you think of Batman Odyssey? At supercontextpodcast@gmail.com. Hey Chris, how you doing, man?
I am okay. We're getting close to the holidays, so I'm thinking about family. And as many of our listeners know, and as you know, I don't really spend a lot of time with family during the holidays on purpose.
Yeah.
One of my family members that I'm thinking about is my father, because I haven't talked to my father in almost 10 years. I talked to him at my sister's wedding, and that was it. But I have mentioned this on the show before, but my dad...
Wait, before we get all the way into the dad stuff...
Yeah.
I do want to point out to the listeners, you and I are recording right before everything happens.
Yeah, this is today, like a week before
Today
Christmas.
Is the day that Trump's been impeached.
Yeah.
Christmas has not yet happened. New Year's has not yet happened. None of us have encountered our family, for the holidays yet. And I just got back from church.
Right, yeah, which is unusual as well.
Very unusual.
So yeah, this is going to be a weird episode, folks, because buckle up. Like, this topic is making us giddy, but also...
It's a goddamn delight, is what it is.
And but it also dredges up stuff like this, for instance. So as I was reading Batman Odyssey, I was thinking about my father, and I was like, oh yeah, my dad, he's in his early 60s, and he believes that the apocalypse is going to happen any day now.
Didn't the deadline already pass for his last prediction?
It did, yeah. So people who are unfamiliar, I've brought this up on the show before, but my understanding through my siblings is that my father believes that like the Revelation style apocalypse is coming any day now, and that a lot of the world events that we've seen recently are like harbingers of the apocalypse.
It's real easy to make connections to like the seas boiling and the seals breaking and many-headed monsters.
A little bit like that when I was a kid. Like a little bit. Like I remember him like kind of like trying to read symbolism into the Book of Revelations, and he'd be like, oh, the swarm of locusts are obviously helicopters. Stuff like that.
No, man, drones.
Right. But so... my understanding is that like he's really embraced these online conspiracy theories that pinpoint exactly when it's going to happen, and to the point that like he did kind of a goodbye world tour a couple of years ago where he went around with his wife and said goodbye to his family members, and then went and saw places he's always wanted to see, like Israel, for instance, because he thought, in such and such date, all this is going to be gone. You're right though, Charlie. That day came and went. And so my understanding is now like it's reset. Like there's a different date. They're doing the math or something.
You know, what's interesting is that many mental health professionals suggest that you live your life like the world's going to come to an end.
Really?
Go see what you want to see.
Oh, I get what you mean.
Go embrace
the
people that are part of your life. Yeah.
Yeah.
Live the things you want to live. And so who knows? Your dad might be doing great.
Well, I mean, I think that it might be good for him mentally, yeah. But I can't help but think about him when I am doing one of my favorite things in the world, which is reading comic books by aging comic book creators.
Yeah, I didn't know this was a genre until
It
I
might
started
be
falling
just
in
for
with
me.
you. No, it's real. Because now that you've sort of pointed it out and explained it, and I've started to follow you along with it, I'm like, oh yeah, this is a thing. People do this.
Well, and I mean, I'm sure it's probably a thing for all creative types, right? Like as they get older. I mean, David Mamet's a good example who we talk about.
They can really lean into it. They can really do a lot of damage.
So like one of my pastimes is I collect Steve Ditko independent comics. Steve Ditko, the co-creator of characters like Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, he in his last like 20 or 30 years just made like at-home DIY zine style comics that were pretty much about libertarianism. And they're fascinating, but they also read like a manifesto from like a cult leader or something. So I'm really interested in stuff like that. And without going too deep into it, you know, these are all of varying shades, but I think we've talked about it on the show before. Like Frank Miller's a little bit like this. Alan Moore has his own tendencies and weirdness that he gets into.
I like that you put Frank Miller up against Alan Moore, though, because like the reactionary conservative versus the radical leftist.
Well, yeah, and if you asked Miller, I don't think he would think of himself as a conservative.
No, he wouldn't.
Howard Chaykin, another good example, who we covered with Divided States of America.
Cultural conservative who calls himself a progressive.
Right, yeah. And so then we hit this, which is Neal Adams' Batman book called Batman Odyssey. And we'll dive deep into it. If you're a listener and you're not a lot familiar with the comics scene or who Neal Adams is or whatever, we will explain all of that shortly. But this is fascinating because it's a book that is by a guy who is considered a master of the medium, and it is sort of his revised thesis statement on not only like his career and characters like Batman, but also like how he thinks the world works.
Yeah. And he presented it as a novel that explores a character that he had a lot to do with for a long time, who has been remediated, recreated,
I mean,
pulled from its origins.
Go look at our episode that we did way back when on the Dark Knight movie, where we ended up talking about like a lot of what makes Batman work is that he's constantly being remediated. There's all these different versions, and everybody has a favorite version, and they don't all coexist very well. And this is a perfect example of that.
So let us thank and blame Exploding Pages on Twitter. At Patient Pyramid is the handle. We got a tweet, I think it was 6-7 months ago. Hey, Super Context, you ever considered doing an episode on Batman Odyssey? And I don't remember exactly how the conversation went, but this is essentially how it went. Hey, Chris, what's Batman Odyssey? Oh, dude, that's Neal Adams. Oh, is he the artist? Yeah, and he wrote it. Okay. No, not okay. And then it started to come out that this series was like a flashpoint for a lot of comic criticism or comics criticism about how creators handled characters, how they handled their sort of self-editing, self-publishing, and definitely reading into that introduced me to Neal Adams as a persona. And then I said, okay, I'm going to read it. And then I found out that you had never read it.
Yeah, I only knew about it from reading, think pieces like we're going to consult today about the book that were basically like, here, we'll do it for you. And just going, oh my God. Like the one in particular that I remember, which is ironically, when you Google search Batman Odyssey, this is the first thing that comes up. Is an old Comics Alliance article that's Laura Hudson and David somebody having a back and forth, basically, where they recap every issue and are just kind of page by page trying to figure out what's going on.
There was a lot of language like, this comic is insane. This comic makes no sense. There's no way you could possibly understand what was going on. I don't know what the story is. I don't know why he did this. And I was prepared for something, which I did not get. I read Batman Odyssey, and then I said to you, we have to do this.
Yeah.
And we put it on the calendar.
So then I
and
read
now
it.
Here we are.
I own it now. I own a copy of Batman Odyssey. And so, okay, there's a lot to unpack here. We are going to set up a ground rule, though, for this episode. Those of you listening may know the last comics episode we did was about Exit Stage Left, the Snagglepuss Chronicles, written by Mark Russell. And during that episode, Mark Russell said something that I think resonated with both of us, which is that one of the ways that he approaches character, even when he's writing, quote, villains, is that he tries to take all of them seriously. And I think it would be really easy for us to be dismissive of Neal Adams and do what a lot of those articles did and go, this is crazy, he's crazy, end of story. But I think there's more going on here. I think there's more under the surface. And I think, part of our super context duty is to unpack what it is and sort of understand how it's making culture. So
it would be very fun to kind of lean into this is insane.
Yeah.
This midnight movie of a comic book. Except that doesn't help us understand how it was made. It doesn't help us understand what Neal Adams was trying to say about Batman and Batman's place in the culture. Yeah.
So let's try to take Neal Adams seriously. We're still going to have fun with this episode. And, given what I know about Neal Adams and what I read in this, I think that there's a certain amount of playfulness on his part as well with this project. I don't think he's deadly serious in a way that he would be offended if
he does come
like
across as a sort of arrogant devil-may-care kind of creator, which is a very old school way of approaching your art process and life.
Well, let's describe what this is and who he is then, because there's probably plenty of listeners who, even if they like comics, are like, yeah, that's not really my thing. So what is this all about? I've kind of veered away from it.
So Batman Odyssey is a 13-issue story. It's been collected as a 2-volume comic book series or a 1-volume comic book series. It's out there as a single graphic novel.
Yeah.
But what it is 13 issues written and drawn by Neal Adams, published between 2010 and 2013.
By DC Comics, the owners of Batman. What you should know, we've probably given you a preview of this already, but this is a book that is both ridiculed within comics fandom and lauded within comics fandom. There are people who come down strongly on the this is what comics should be side, and there are people who come down on the holy shit, what is this side.
And it has been compared to The Room, the legendarily bad but inspired film. And it's been compared to A Public Meltdown or A Cry for Help.
So I think you have to understand, though, that the big difference is that Neal Adams, this isn't just like something that came out of nowhere. He has been making comics for 50 years, and he's one of the best known comic book creators in the world, and rightfully so. So he is known for his defining runs on books like Batman and Green Arrow and Green Lantern and X-Men.
And in fact, if you look at Neal Adams covers as a neophyte, as I have, I recognize everything about Neal Adams' artwork.
Yeah.
It is like, oh, this is what I thought comics just were. But it turns out that Neal Adams was incredibly prolific at the time that I was really paying attention to comic books the first time round.
Yeah, that makes sense given our age. He is also a strong fighter for creative rights in comics, and that we cannot skip over. So he's a major advocate. We won't go real deep into that here, but he fought for the creators of Superman, and he fought for Jack Kirby, and all of this in the late 70s and early 80s. And a lot of people say that creators wouldn't have the rights they have now if it weren't for Neal Adams.
Yeah, and he is an artist who came to prominence after sort of the first wave of artists got screwed.
Right.
Like he saw what happened. Yeah. He saw the stuff that makes people say comics will break your heart. And he had enough cachet and power and persistence to be public about it. And I guess he just muscled his way through the being beaten down part. And he got to the other side of his major career, I guess, with an intact heart.
And we've actually done an episode with him before. We did a Christmas episode a few years ago about Dead Man and talked about Neal Adams' work on the original Dead Man series.
Oh my God, this is the ghost of the Neal Adams episode about ghosts right after the ghost episode about the ghost of the shining ghost.
Perfect.
Of the...
So what is probably helpful for you to know is this. Neal Adams still does comics. He still works for all the major publishers. He does covers. He does his own books. He still runs a studio. He also regularly attends comic book conventions. And I didn't put this in the notes, Charlie, but let me explain a little bit further because I see Neal Adams at almost every show I do. He does a lot of conventions. And he doesn't do conventions the same way most artists do when they set up an artist alley and they have a table and they sell their books or they do original commissions. He does that. But Neal Adams has like I don't know how to describe it other than like a huge circus-like exhibitor booth that he sets up at every show that features his work and sells prints, originals, whatever. It's an entire merchandising mini empire, like a cottage industry based around his work, but it is also including his family members. So his children are mostly all artists, I believe, and they also set up there and do sell their work. One of his kids is a sculptor, I think, and one of his kids worked on this book, actually, or two of them worked on this book. So it is this kind of thing that you'll see at almost every major comic book convention is this massive Neal Adams booth. And he's usually treated kind of like a guest of honor. And old fans of comics fucking love it. And they love coming up and meeting him and buying stuff from him. Last show I did, we walked by Neal Adams' booth as we were setting up, and he and the family were unpacking all their stuff and putting things out on placards. And they had an original that was like no, it wasn't even an original. It was a print, and it was a Batman print, and it was like tagged $450. And I was like, holy shit, that guy charges that much money for not even original art, you know? My understanding is he charges for his signature, which is kind of a thing that people flip-flop about whether or not that's kosher or not. He's in it to win it.
Yeah, and we should make sure that we put that up against the fact that he is revered also. Yeah. He is a member of the Eisner's Hall of Fame, the Jack Kirby Hall of Fame, and I don't know who Joe Sinnott is, but the Joe Sinnott Hall of Fame inducted Neal Adams in 2019.
Yeah, Sinnott was another, I guess, Golden Age comic book creator, worked with Kirby on a lot of stuff. I think Sinnott was primarily an inker, if I'm remembering correctly.
So it's important to point out that Neal Adams has the credibility, the credentials, right, of a very important comic book artist, and he also has the hustle and push of a self-aggrandizing promoter.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. And I don't think he would back down from that description either. Like he fully embraces that. Okay, a couple other things we should right off the bat mention, because these are the things you will find out about Neal Adams.
Yeah, this is vaguely gossipy, except it's totally part of what he presents as his public image.
And is relevant to this book. So Neal Adams is a fervent advocate for something called the expanding Earth hypothesis, although I don't think that Adams likes using that term. That's how other people describe it. But basically, this hypothesis is that the Earth is hollow on the inside and that the planet is constantly growing. Now, there's a lot of argument back and forth. We're not going to do an episode on this, but a lot of people say that's pseudoscience.
No, we are not. We are not talking about that.
I will just say, like, Adams is so into this that he's produced a DVD and multiple YouTube videos with commentary about his belief. Like, you can go on YouTube and watch hours of him standing in front of a PowerPoint slide telling you why expanding Earth is reasonable.
Oh, you sure could, couldn't you?
I've tried. I've tried.
Don't do it. Don't do it.
If you want like the real, like, let's boil it down bio, this comes from iFanboy, which is a very popular comic book podcast. They say Neal Adams is what is commonly known as a, quote, Renaissance man. He is the writer, artist, and animator, and he's much more. For 50 years, his work has been making an impact in comics and beyond. He's known at Marvel for his runs on the X-Men and Avengers, and at Crosstown Rivals DC, they also sought his services, and they got them in spades with his legendary runs on Deadman, Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and of course Batman.
Now, in a feature on Neal Adams, Zachary Petit wrote that the thing about Neal Adams is he doesn't really come across as the most, well, modest man. Your work is pretty amazing, a young fan gushes to Adams at a recent comic convention. I've noticed that, Adams replies. I have noticed that. So he's 73 at the time of this feature, and Petit describes him as opinionated, outspoken, wildly talented, engaging, a born cusser and a born hustler. In parentheses, you should see him hawking his artwork at these conventions. And that's all undoubtedly how he's been in the game so long.
Yeah, so, I mean, without getting too gossipy here, everything Zachary Petit says there is accurate in terms of my understanding of Neal Adams. It shows. I've never talked to him personally, but like, you know, I do 5 to 10 shows a year. I see him at a lot of these things. I hear things from a lot of people who run shows or other creators. That's exactly the impression I have been given, is that like he is constantly trying to sell you something. He has a pretty big ego, and and he's not afraid to tell you.
Yeah. Here's some directly from Adams quotes. If I get rejected, I just come back. Look, there's nobody within the comic business that's 5 years my junior or 5 years my senior. There's nobody in comics that's a contemporary of mine. They don't exist. There's 10 years of blank. So obviously, I was a very stubborn, aggressive, positive person. You don't get to be somebody like me without being very, very tough.
Okay, well, let's unpack this for a second, because I believe we put this same quote out there into the world when we did our Deadman episode. What he says this a lot in interviews. This is like a pat thing that he says, like, I have no contemporaries that are within a 10-year...
I'm the only guy who made it out of the Valley of Death.
Yeah, exactly. Like, basically, like, I'm the only person of quality who was making comics when I started making comics that is still making comics. And one of the things he returns to often is he says... there wasn't a lot of competition for me back in the day. That's why I was considered the best. And nowadays, the comics book industry has more competition and there's more talent in it. So he's like weirdly bashing his peers while at the same time praising the kids who have come up underneath him.
Yeah. So he's never only prideful. He's never only talented. You know, he's an interesting character. When he talks about Batman, so from an outsider's point of view, I can say this.
Yeah.
Neal Adams came into Batman at a time when the sort of kitsch of Batman was overtaking the kind of grit of Batman.
Right, because of the TV show.
Yeah, I think it would be very hard for someone right now to really understand how goofy Batman was for a certain period of time.
Another thing I'll throw out there, this is anecdotal, but when I was studying comics in grad school, one of the things we learned was that because of the success of that Batman television show, comic book sales for superheroes went up. And so a lot of superhero comics started to reflect the narrative tone of the TV show in order to sort of keep those readers coming back.
A kind of dry whimsy, almost.
Yeah, he's campy.
Yeah. This is how I learned what camp was.
I think that's
my parents explaining the
our
Batman
generation's like thesaurus for campy is the Batman TV show.
So then Adams says, I like Batman because I was able to bring him to what he was supposed to be. I didn't change him, I just brought him back to what he was supposed to be. That is to say, away from the campy nostalgia of the TV show and back to brooding.
Okay, so that pretty firmly establishes who Neal Adams is and what he thinks Batman should be as a character. So as I mentioned, this Laura Hudson, David Walken piece on Comics Alliance is a pretty popular go-to site for understanding Odyssey. And it begins with Laura saying to David, have you read any of the interviews that Neal Adams did about Batman Odyssey? Because hearing him explain the book really helped set the stage for me in a couple of ways. And she provides this quote, which we will dive into further because we pulled the full interview. Neal Adams has said this about Odyssey. I have simply wandered along this trail, like a deer stalker, you might say, and retrieved all these bits and pieces that have been left lying around. And then when he's asked to give an overview of the plot for this book, he says, I cannot give you an overview of the plot.
Now, in this article, this sort of meta article about the interview, Laura and David are, if not ferocious, then they are very fast to take everything that Neal Adams says as a joke and to find the foolishness in it. Like, for that quote, they say, oh, I don't think that's what a deer stalker does, is it?
Right.
And they really lean into the whole, I cannot give you an overview of the plot as some kind of failure in, some kind of artistic failure.
I'll just throw out there that Laura Hudson is one of my favorite writers about not just comics, but about pop culture and entertainment in general.
I don't want to say that this is a reflection of their character so much as it's a reflection of what this comic did to a lot of people.
Yeah, it's the tone that most people approach it with. Mm-hmm.
Here's the full quote, though, from Adams when he says, I cannot give you an overview of the plot. I cannot give you an overview of the plot. That would be too much. But I can tickle your fancy. As Batman moves into a new, more violent world, his foes are more deadly, his danger greater, the weaponry more powerful, and inevitably, his resolution will be by nature dulled with time. Suppose he's just a little less aware, a little bit more easily fooled. Could even Batman be taken advantage of? His actions compromised and corrupt without him even knowing? Seems impossible, doesn't it? But let us say even a small portion of this is true. Like the rest of us, Batman might have to re-examine his whole reason for being. That, like the rest of us, is a big part of this.
I think that is one of the key thesis statements about not just Batman Odyssey, but Neal Adams and his approach to Batman Odyssey.
What was Neal Adams doing here? And he says, like great heroes of the past, Batman may also have to go on an odyssey to find the thing that he could have nearly lost himself. Where would this odyssey take him to? He seems to have done everything. Oh, no, he hasn't.
Okay, and now we have got a lot of interviews where he talks about how he made this and how he wrote it and the ways in which he wrote it.
Before we do that, Chris, we should take a crack at it.
Yeah, I want you...
Can you explain the plot?
No, I want you to do it because I'm the comics nerd on the show, and so I understand a lot of the relationships between the characters that are brought in.
Right,
and you do not. So I want you to try to explain it to our audience. What is the plot of Batman Odyssey?
I cannot give you an overview of that. No. So Batman is telling a story to Superman, who is in the guise of Clark Kent.
But we don't know that until the
we
very
don't know
last
that.
issue.
I'm just trying to give. This is what happens, right? Yeah. And the structure of it is very different from.
In a lot of ways, it's set up that Batman is telling a story to us, the reader.
Yeah, but Batman is in his Batcave. He's talking to Superman, who is in character as Clark Kent as a journalist. He is explaining this whole long thing, this epic odyssey that happened, that he had to sort of deal with a series of mysteries, clues, riddles, and adventures. So he's giving us a flashback, essentially.
But why is he telling this story?
Wait, I'm trying to do this. Within that flashback, he also then flashes back farther to the roots of various things that he's trying to explain. Mm. So, Batman and Robin do something because Man-Bat shows up at the Batcave and they talk about guns and then they foil a robbery of a car and then Aquaman saves them from a monster, and then they go to the center of the earth, and Deadman comes with them to help them out, and they meet analogs of themselves in a center of the earth culture, and then they return and find out that all along the bad guys of Arkham have been sort of operating in a kind of meta way to make Batman both ridiculous and also not dangerous. And so he sets up some weird kind of con to scare all of the bad guys of Arkham back into fearing Batman. And all through this, there's this insistence that Batman doesn't kill or uses guns. So the con involves him pretending to kill somebody.
Yeah. So, and this is like a integral part of how many people understand the character. That
How does that sound? I don't feel confident about that.
You're as close as I think it's possible to get. I mean, I would just say this was printed in 2 volumes. I think the first volume is Batman is trying to come up with a thesis statement for why he doesn't use guns. And he relays a story about how his first time out as Batman, he did use guns and how it went wrong.
And he got shot.
Yeah. And then he uses the rest of this as a way to explain, well, this is also why I don't use guns. And
yeah,
the second volume is where it gets really sci-fi because it involves all of the well, the whole time Batman has been distracted by these ridiculous supervillains because these other ridiculous supervillains didn't want him to go to the center of the earth and find out about this plot that they were hatching.
Yeah, and the character of the book is that every time something that is sort of an established relationship is brought up, there is some crafted revelation that pops up that changes that relationship. And by relationship, I mean when we hear Batman and Robin talking about how they work together or how they connected, built into that is then a revelation that there's something we didn't know about how Batman and Robin connected.
Yeah.
Between, what's her name, Talia and Batman, between Aquaman and Batman, between Superman and Batman, between Batman and the dinosaurs inside the Earth, between Batman and the Arkham villains, between Batman and Commissioner Gordon. All of these things get these plot twists, these revelations that are usually inside moments that don't relate to that revelation.
Right. And some of this seems like it would affect continuity, and then some of it seems like it doesn't at all, because they are somewhat big revelations within the mythology of
you
Batman
mean continuity of the entire Batman series, right?
Vaguely.
Yeah, this is almost outside of any comic book reality we've ever encountered.
So that's what's interesting, right? Is the fanboy aspect of it tries to figure out, where does this fit in continuity? Which narrative storyline is this plugged into? Which Earth is this taking place on? Which Batman is this? Which Robin is this? When? I saw a lot of that in the reviews and articles about it. We're going to skip over that entirely because I don't think it's particularly useful to our understanding.
It's not something I can talk about.
Yeah, and I think that Adams himself probably thinks about this as this is a thing I did that just exists on its own. Figure it out yourself.
There's a little bit of that, but also Neal Adams presents this as kind of him putting Batman to bed for himself.
Yeah.
For instance, here's some more stuff from Adams about Batman and his work. He says, every time I go to a convention or go into a comic book shop, which, as Chris says, is every day, people drag me off into a corner and beat me up and go, when are you going to do Batman again? This is how Adams talks, right? This is also how the book Batman Odyssey works.
Sounds. All the characters sound like Neal Adams.
They sound like him, and also the way that things are presented are extreme all the time. Yeah. Neal Adams is saying, fans come up to me and say, when are you going to do Batman again? But he says, they drag me off into a corner and beat me up and say this. It has occurred to me over the years that little bits and pieces have dropped along the way as Batman has been done. I've sort of wondered why people haven't dealt with or done too much with these various pieces. So when the opportunity presented itself by my deciding I want to step into the comic book thing again because I'm tired of doing these alternate covers and these little bits and pieces for Marvel and DC that don't amount to a hill of beans, I think I ought to do a project. Now, here you go. There's another thing.
Yeah.
This is how the comic book works. He's telling us a thing happened, but then inside it he says, oh, and the reason that this thing is happening is before this, I said this. And
yeah, the entire comic book and his statements operate
and Neal Adams' way of talking
grammatically like a sentence that is supposed to have M dashes that has another sentence buried inside of it, but he ignores the grammar of M dashes.
Yeah, his parentheticals are whole sentences.
Yep.
So I'm just going to sum this part up. Neal Adams had a moment. He said, I don't want to do covers. I want to do a real project. And they said, why don't you do Batman? And he wanted to take the character of Batman back. He said, I realized that the eggs I had laid all those years ago were basically what Batman has finally become. He said what he laid out in his Batman runs as an artist, really, not as a writer, but as an artist, led to the Batman we think of now. So he said, wouldn't it be great if I could go pick up all those pieces I've been gathering up and turn them into a story?
So he goes on to say that he thinks as Batman exists now in continuity within DC Comics, and by now we mean 2010 to 2013 when he was working on this, he says it's outdated. It doesn't make any sense in contrast with reality.
Yeah, he says so for Batman to work these days, you have to load him up with armor and devices.
Yeah.
You know,
citing the movies.
Yeah, setting it in contrast to when Batman arrived, he was basically a private detective who wore a batsuit.
Yeah, he was James Bond.
Yeah.
And now he's right. So he has to wear all this armor. And the explanations, what he's sort of beating around the bush here with is gun violence, right? So gun violence is so bad in the real world that if you were to go out as Batman, you would immediately be shot and killed. And that is in a lot of ways what this book is about.
Yeah. Whereas before, if a criminal pulled out a little snub-nosed 38 or something, the idea was that Batman could kick him.
Right.
And it would be over.
Yeah.
But now we have militarized crime as much as we have militarized police.
So Adams goes on and says there's other questions that need to be dealt with. These are very in continuity questions, so I'm going to go over them pretty quickly. For instance, why does Batman not put criminals in jail? He puts them in Arkham Asylum instead. And if you've seen any of the Batman movies, you know this, right? You fight the Joker, you capture him. For some reason, the Joker never goes to jail. He goes to this insane asylum where all of Batman's villains are kept.
Yeah, costumed villains are insane and have to be dealt with differently than muggers.
So Adams says this is a fantasy world that Batman lives in, so we have to figure out how Batman deals with the more deadly world that we actually live in when his code is so inflexible because he won't kill anybody or maim anybody.
Stop there for just a second.
Yeah.
I believe that Batman kills people, does he not?
Yeah, so this is like an ongoing, like debatable thing. But
I don't even know what I'm stepping in. I just know that it's Snyder Batman.
Yeah, right. No, that's one of the issues that people have with Snyder Batman is that he kills people.
And so does Superman. Oh, so Snyder, he just has people kill people.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay,
and so
got it.
There is a constant like push and pull within Batman storylines of like, yeah, but if he were to operate, he would have to kill people, right? But at the same time, they say, but that's what makes Batman different, and Batman, the hero that we follow the narratives of, is that he won't kill people.
Yeah.
And he won't use guns.
I'm being a little flippant about Snyder, I think because I need a steam valve. I need just a little vent for... There's a lot of stuff about this Neal Adams work that we're not... As we said at the beginning, we're not going like cuckoo bananas about how nutsy it is. We're trying to find the truth behind the things he's doing here.
Well, let's not bury the lead either. I mean, we're assuming that everybody listening knows this, but Batman is one of the most profitable characters in the history of entertainment. Like, there's constantly new content being created with him in it, and DC, Warner Brothers, and AT&T are constantly making money off of it.
Yeah. And so there are many versions of Batman, right? So Adams says he Batman is supposed to scare the bad guys. They're supposed to be terrified of Batman. So if they up their game, how does he up his game? How does Batman deal with crime on a new level? And it occurred to me, Neal Adams says, if you start throwing this stuff at Batman hard enough and enough of it sticks, he's going to have to reconsider his role. And that's what this story is about. In reconsidering his role, he ought to go someplace.
So, okay. But no, let's just like zoom out of this like at a big level. So what he's saying without actually spelling it out, because at the time the book wasn't finished, the place that he sends Batman to discover himself is a cave, because Batman is a bat. And so of course he's going to tie the cave thing into Hollow Earth theory. And so Batman goes to the center of the earth, and that's where he learns about himself and how to deal with this issue.
Yeah. There's a place where Batman can go to relearn and rediscover himself. That's what the story's about. It's the story, this is Neal Adams, it's the story of a place that he can be driven to where the lessons can be learned. And that place is a surprise.
So for all of the commentary about how this book is crazy and insane, it actually kind of makes sense. Like when you unpack all this, you go, all right, I see what you're trying to do here.
The sort of step-by-step, like why are each of these things happening, they make sense even though they're often quite silly.
Within the moment of the actual reading is when it feels like you're going crazy.
Yeah, and especially because everybody has dialogue that operates like a continuously restarting thought.
Yeah, so this is a good point where I'm going to plant, this is my subjective point of view. I think what's going on with this book is not as much that the story is crazy or that Neal Adams himself is crazy as it is not using the medium of comics the right way to tell this story. So there are things like the transitions from panel to panel, the dialogue, the way the dialogue is written, the way things are introduced and how continuity within the story itself is forgotten, not even Batman continuity. So there's just like a lot of, like it feels like it needed an editor.
There's a lot of dialogue in the book that feels like it was written for a movie, right?
Yeah.
And then was put into a thought bubble. So you need more sense of the pauses. You need a sense of the intonations. You need the rat-a-tat-tat rhythm of screwball comedy for things to work. But it doesn't work in a lot of ways, unless, of course, the whole point is to create this kind of fugue that you enter into.
Right. Then you get into an even bigger meta conversation, which is Neal Adams purposely writing it like this? I do not think he is. I believe what's going on here is that the conventions of the medium that Neal Adams established in the 70s are now different from how we understand the language of comic books today in the 2010s. Yeah. And so when he tries to apply that to the narrative storytelling, this is like his Breaking Bad. And when he tries to apply that to complex storytelling, it doesn't work.
Yeah, and there's just enough in how Adams describes his goals that you can start to say, oh, was this on purpose? Like he says of Batman, he starts to realize that maybe he's not as in control as he thought.
Okay, this is sort of I think that is like, bam, like even Adams himself, I don't think understands what this is about. And I think that and the statement that he made earlier about it's about Batman re-examining what his life means.
You should be very clear about what you're trying to say, the connection to Neal Adams as a person that you're trying to make.
I think the whole key here is that this is a man who is looking at the world, not Batman, Neal Adams, is a man looking at the world and trying to make sense of it, having thought he understood it, and having thought that he was in control of things, and that he this is a man who people have told for the last 50 years, you are one of the best artists ever, you're the best person, I love you. And now he's trying to like recalibrate and make sense of the world because he realizes, oh, wait a minute, I don't have as much control as I thought I did.
Yeah. And he says of Batman in the story, Is he becoming trite? Is he being used? And does he really think about everything that he's about? Is there a place
it seems like he's almost talking about himself.
I mean, yeah, it's
right?
totally Is there a place for him to realize it? A place for him to go where he can realize it and come back a better Batman? And Neal Adams, it's not all the time, but he has a tendency to roll back and talk about himself in third person, or to try and say what other people are saying about him.
Yeah, I tried to mark it here in the notes so we could keep track of it. He talks about himself in the third person often.
Yeah. So it's almost like he's setting us up to imagine that he's also talking about himself.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how can you come back and be a better Batman? How can Neal come back and be a better Neal?
So, okay. So, again, like, he keeps getting asked, he keeps saying the same answers to these questions. I went around and I scooped up the pieces like a deer stalker of all these things that various creators have done with Batman over the years. But when he's asked about how the actual project came about, it starts to make a little bit more sense. Because Frank Miller was involved. So he says, my friend Frank Miller heard that I was showing an interest in doing comics again, so he talked to Bob Schreck. And Bob Schreck is one of the smartest young men in comics, and he ran with the ball. Let me just interject here for a second. Bob Schreck is the reason why I still do comics. Like, hands down, I went to a convention when I first started doing comics, and I had a portfolio review with Bob Schreck. And he gave me the confidence and instilled in me, like, the, drive to keep doing what I'm doing now 10, 11 years later. Schreck is one of the most important, like, shepherds of comics as far as I'm concerned. Awesome. He started Oni Press. He worked as an editor there, at Dark Horse, at DC, and at Legendary Studios. He's a very important unheralded figure within comic books. So I agree with Neal Adams here. At the same time, Bob Schreck is I think he would laugh as well. I think he's in his 60s, so I think it's kind of like a joke that Neal Adams is referring to him as a young man. And also, I've seen Schreck give presentations at multiple conventions where he talks about his relationship with Frank Miller. And it essentially goes like this. Frank Miller will call up Schreck, whichever company Schreck's working at the time, and say, hey, you want to fuck with some people? And then they put out whatever, Frank Miller's new project is that will incite, rage among fanboys. And I
actually really enjoy that.
I think this is a little similar. I think what's going on here with Neal Adams is similar.
Okay, so let's try and put all that together. Neal Adams, who is a revered comics creator, artist, was in a phase of his work where he was kind of doing commissions either for fans or for companies, doing covers, doing reworks, not doing a lot of original narrative work. And he wanted to do something different. He wanted to go back and do narrative. And he's friendly with Frank Miller. So he told Frank. And Frank said, hey, I got this relationship with Bob where we just do stuff. And he tried to connect Neal Adams with Bob so they could do this project. And Frank Miller agreed at the beginning to write some of the book.
Yeah. So they were going to co-write it. And Miller was going to write the dialogue. But now, the way that it's reported is that he had to drop out due to scheduling issues. And Neal Adams comments on that, and he says, I didn't exactly need the help, since I have done a lot more writing in comics than people seem to be aware of.
Stop. I do think it's time to say very explicitly, my subjective opinion is that he needed the help desperately.
He might have, yeah.
That in a lot of ways, the dialogue is what confounds and distracts the kind of nutsy story. I mean, it's a nutsy story in that a lot of things just happen, and this happens, and this happens, and then the thing jumps up, and then the thing is, and this happens. But the dialogue is what really lays a kind of fog across a lot of the logic of the story.
I agree. And in some of the pieces, especially that Laura Hudson, David Warlitz piece, they even say, look, like if you take all the balloons off the page, this guy is clearly still a master of visual storytelling. Like you look at the pages and you're like, wow, this is gorgeous. This guy's doing some really cool stuff.
And remember, you said it felt like he wasn't doing comics well. He wasn't doing comics the right, quote unquote, right way.
It was like he was speaking comics in a different language, right? Like an accent.
Despite the fact that the pages were really impressive to these comic critics.
Yeah. Okay, so he says, I didn't need the help. And then he says, look, here's the thing. Frank, if he had written it, he would have offered the following things. He would have drawn more sales because he's popular. But you have to remember that he basically was trained by me, Neal Adams. You probably know this from his interviews.
Chris, we have to read the whole thing.
Okay.
Neal Adams is so hard to summarize.
All right,
so he says, I didn't exactly need the help from Frank Miller, since I have done a lot more writing in comics than people seem to be aware of. Once I get through plot, outline, and dialogue, that's pretty much the writing. Of course, the sacrifice is, 1, whatever Frank's contribution would have been. That phrase does so much work in this moment, Chris. And 2, Frank's draw as far as sales are concerned. On the other hand, since I had something to do with the early training of Frank Miller, as you probably know from his interviews, even Frank was curious to know how this epic would turn out. Just as I am curious and excited to know how Frank's projects will turn out.
Yeah, so like this is like, imagine somebody
I want Fred Willard to play Neal Adams in a Christopher Guest improv movie about the comics industry.
You know, that would actually be pretty apropos.
I think that would be, I think that would be so cool.
All right, and then he goes, this is him talking in the third person. So it may sound like somebody else is talking about him, but this is Neal talking about Neal. He says, the idea of thinking of Neal as an artist as opposed to a writer is very odd to me. I think of myself as a storyteller, and one of the reasons why people have held my stuff close to them is because one thing I do is draw pretty pictures, but the other thing I do is create a story. And that's what I've always done, whether it be for advertising clients or commercial clients or for comic books. My hand is in there, and I am the storyteller.
Okay.
So he wants, part of his agenda with doing Batman Odyssey is to let people know, I am not just an artist, I am also a writer, and I can write these stories too.
And he presents his title, Odyssey, as being like a thesis statement, all in the just the title of the series. It's a journey, it's a personal journey. It is... he says a gut slammer and an odyssey at the same time. And I've been trying to warn people, you really have to start the story on book 1. So he's presenting
Let's spell out what that means. So this came out in single issues, like most comics do, but it was like, I don't know, issue 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of volume 1. And then there was a little bit of a gap. And then there was another issue 1 that was really issue 8. Yeah. But it's comics.
So it was almost implied that you could now, if you wanted, you could jump in on the Neal Adams Odyssey.
And you absolutely could not.
You could not. And he is saying, this is a long-form narrative. This is practically a novel. This is an odyssey. It's like the Odyssey of Greek fame. You know, my character is going on a journey that will bring him back to himself.
Yeah.
And he says straight up that he wants to get Batman back to Batman.
Yeah, and so he says there's a back and forth that goes on in the comic book business that we talk about, but we don't like to talk about. And that is the need for change of characters as opposed to throwing out the baby with the bathwater with these changes. He lists a bunch of things that have happened with characters over the last 25 years. And he says, I don't like it when there's irresponsible changes made to characters. One of the things he cites is Aquaman getting his hand cut off and having a hook hand and then all of a sudden having a hand again. This is the kind of like continuity stuff that Neal Adams thinks is breaking comics.
He's been around long enough that he's seen things go from, we'll add a little bit of backstory or a slight change of the character all the way up to retcons and reboots. He says, my feeling is this. If a creative wants to change a character completely, not just save it or make it better, but change it, go create your own damn character.
This is what Stephen King was saying in our Dr. Sleep episode, right? Basically, like, go find your own dinner.
Yeah.
Go write your own thing. You don't need to be involved in this if you wanna play around with it so much.
And then Neal Adams says, that's what I'm doing with Batman in my little epic. The same, only better.
Okay. So then somebody else asks him, and all of these interviews will be linked to on our landing page if you want to read them through yourself. They ask him what the creative process is like when he works on something like Odyssey, because he's both writing and drawing it. And he says, writing is a separate process from drawing. If you're lucky, they come together. The writer in me has had to question if the artist in me could do certain things. And the artist in me, when the script is complete, curses the writer in me for putting too many panels on a page and begging to open the story up because he needs more pages. This is the kind of thing that he again said in like every interview, that like he would write the script and then he would sit down and he would draw it and he'd be like, oh, why did I write it that way? Why are there so many panels?
This feels like the most self-aware.
Yeah, I agree.
That Neal Adams has been in these interviews. And it also makes me like him a little more, that he can describe this back and forth.
Yeah. I mean, outside of all of this, this guy is still one of the best comic book creators in the history of the medium. And he'll let you know that, because he says here, look, I'm not that impressed with the fact that back in the day, I really didn't have much competition, except for some notable notables. He doesn't name their names, he just calls them notable notables. Now, because somebody has pushed the business's boundaries with higher rates and return of original art and royalties and creator ownership, so he's referencing himself here. Let's point out. He says somebody, he means him. More and more tremendously talented creatives are writing and drawing comics. Therefore, competition is much, much stiffer than it used to be. I had to go back to my A game for Batman Odyssey.
This is what you were talking about, that he talks about himself in the third person, and not just Neal says by him saying that, but he actually kind of doesn't tell you that he's talking about himself when he trumps it. You know, people are saying that we're pushing back to, creative ownership.
No, I think there's something to be said for that. Like, without dragging the president into it, there is a kind of secondhand language that I think baby boomer men fall into when they're telling stories. And it's almost like...
It's like an attempt at politeness.
Yeah.
It's sort of like the British, you refer to yourself as one. One refers to oneself as opposed to saying I.
Yeah.
And this is like boomers, and I'm sure other folks, but like what we're finding here is you say, I was a part of a movement by saying there was a movement.
Yeah.
Or you say, I think this by saying some people think.
How about this? Rather than citing evidence or sources for things, they don't feel like they have to, because they consider themselves to be experts on the world, and therefore it's unnecessary for them to provide evidence for their claims.
Okay, speaking of claims that don't have any evidence, Neal Adams says, Batman Odyssey, you have to read it. It's a book. I told people at the beginning, now that I'm coming back, I'm going to be doing a book. I'm not going to be doing a series of stories. Or you're going to read the first story and then wonder, am I going to like the second story as much as I did or didn't like the first? Oh my God. It's like word salad, Chris. Yeah. There are moments when I'm reading Neal Adams's quotes and I feel crazy.
It's tough. And I think that that's what reading the book can be like for folks as well. Long story short, let's sum up these next couple paragraphs. He's basically saying that, like, because I stood up for creators in the 70s, the industry has become better and everybody is paid fairly and they have all the rights they should. By the way, I would argue with all of that. Like, I am glad Neal did what he did for creator ownership, but creators are still treated like shit today. But he says because they're treated better than they were, therefore the industry is better, there's better storytelling going on.
There's more opportunities to work with these characters, and I'm going to take advantage of that. I'm going to write a book. And
so he sees this approach to Batman as, here's the deerstalker metaphor again. Like, he's going around, he's picking up all these pieces that these master storytellers have put down with Batman, but not really followed up on.
Well, listen to this. This is how he sums it up. And he said that deerstalker thing several times. And he says, I've been picking up Easter eggs and all that. But this is what he says. I did a thing called Batman Odyssey, where I took a whole lot of pieces of Batman's life and gathered them together and swept them out of the driveway and put them in a little pile and told a story. It was 13 chapters, and it seemed like I was alluding to stuff.
I think that right there is the best thesis statement you're ever going to get for this book.
It is a clear description with absolutely nothing to it. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean anything, you know?
But look, we're trying to take Neal Adams seriously here, right?
I recognize what he's saying, but notice that he doesn't tell you, I went looking for old continuity errors or changes that I didn't appreciate. I mean, he just says, I just took a bunch of stuff and I put it together and I made a story. There's a very, he's just declaring that he went after something in a very intuitive way and trusted his time in the industry to get him through it.
Now, something that he didn't mention in a lot of the interviews are the people who helped him out with this book. It says, when you open up the book, it says, written by Neal Adams, illustrated by Neal Adams. But Neal Adams is from like the old school production mode of comics where other people are doing the inking, the coloring, the lettering. And we should mention that part of that is that he, for 50 years now, has run his own studio that a lot of these folks work at. It's called Continuity Studios. It's based out of both New York City and LA. It was formed by him and Dick Giordano, who was another legendary comic book creator. This company does everything from motion picture storyboards to graphic design to animation to 3D graphics to concept art. And
he talked about commercial and advertising clients. Yeah.
This is through Continuity. They also do packaging for comic book publishers. So like if a comic book is made, they'll do the print production stuff on like putting the cover together and the
So this is what he's referring to when he's talking about like I was tired of just doing covers. I was tired of doing work for hire because he this is how he's been making a living and he wanted to do a story.
Yeah. A lot of notable comic book creators have worked at Continuity over the years. We're not going to list them all. But on this book, on these 13 issues of this Batman storyline, the following people worked on it. And some of these names won't mean anything to you, Charlie, but these are like legendary comic book creators.
Okay. Well, I recognize Bill
Sienkiewicz, yeah.
Sienkiewicz?
Yeah, that's how it's pronounced.
Son of a bitch.
Bill Sienkiewicz is one of the folks who created Legion. That's why you know it, because you see his name before every episode of Legion. Okay. The inks were done by Michael Golden, Scott Williams, Bill Sienkiewicz, Paul Neary, Josh Adams, who I believe is Neal Adams' son, and Kevin Nolan. At least 3 of those people are like top level tier artists, not just inkers. Like these are really high quality creators working on this. And then for the coloring, Continuity is cited, like the entire studio. Then Ginger Caralexis, Corey Adams, Moose Bauman, and Guy Major. I don't know any of those people. I don't know who they are. I'm going to guess Corey Adams is another member of the Adams family. No pun intended. And then for lettering, Rob Lee, Ken Lopez, and Dave Sharp lettered this book. So a lot of people worked on this. Neal Adams wrote the story, and he laid out and he penciled the pages. But then people who were either colleagues of his in the industry or worked with him at Continuity inked it and colored it, packaged it, and sent it over to DC.
And at the beginning of the creation of Batman Odyssey, there was a certain amount of, I'm going to do it all myself, but then he started bringing people in, and he has this to say about that. I'm bringing people in rather slowly. The process has been a very long process, and what's happening now is that people are being brought in carefully so I don't get criticism from fans on, why'd you do this, or how come you let this guy do that? I'm trying to ease people into it to make them part of the storytelling. An awful lot of it was done before other people were invited in. It's a delicate situation. There's a lot of fan concern.
I think what he means there is like there's fans who are like, oh no, you should ink every page. You should have your hands on every aspect of this.
I feel like behind that is a little bit of, well, people say to me like, you're so good. Why are you having anyone else do it?
Yeah. We would be remiss if we did not talk about DC Comics for a minute. We've been talking about them a lot lately this year. The last comics episode we did was another DC episode. DC is a huge American comic book publisher. They're even bigger because they're currently owned by Warner Brothers, who is currently owned by AT&T. So it's kind of fascinating to think about this massive corporation holding on to the IP for this incredibly popular money-making character, and then saying to Neal Adams, hey, you worked on this 50 years ago, just take it and run with it and do whatever you want.
And in a way, we have to think of DC Comics as holding the rights to 3 of the top, if not the 3 top comics ideas in America. Like
Batman,
Superman
and Wonder
Batman
Woman.
and Wonder Woman are almost like the definition of comic books. Now, recently, Marvel and thus Disney have had this huge success. They've built this tremendous setup.
Yeah.
But like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, that was the entirety of the televisual, comic penetration in America for a long time.
It's why they are referred to within DC as the Trinity, Charlie. I'm not joking. Like,
no,
as if they are the Holy Ghost, Jesus, and God. They are considered to be the holiest of holies.
I feel like you've been out of the game for a long time, Chris, if you did the Trinity in that order.
Why don't we take a break? We can review our Bibles, and then when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about how this book sold within the comic book market, and then look at what the actual themes were that Adams was trying to get across in this storyline.
Oh, boy. So, Chris, are we self-aware, or are we just running on our own fumes with this podcast? What do you think?
I mean, I think one of the things that's nice about having a Patreon community involved is that they can sort of steer us away from just running on our own fumes. It's the closest we can have to having an editor on this show.
Yeah, there have been a couple tweets recently where people kind of poked me back into shape. Like, hey, whoa. Jason and Ross, for instance, have both called me out on some dumb mistakes I've made, which keeps me pretty humble. A lot better than the like hardcore, you guys fucking suck, you should, stop talking and, go outside kind of reviews that we've gotten occasionally.
Yeah, see our review that's currently sitting on top of our iTunes reviews, which is pretty hilarious.
Yeah. Hey, if anybody feels like doing us a favor, go put an iTunes review up and try and knock a mean vagina trick down the list.
Now, our joke, though, leads into something pretty serious, which is that we wouldn't be able to do this show without our listeners and without the Patreon community and the campaign. They've all transformed the show. The support of our listeners has allowed us to do things like pay for our hosting fees, cover our expenses for media artifacts that are researched, and update our recording setup so that you get this better quality production out of the show.
Yeah, and not only have we been supported monetarily, we've also been supported conceptually. People have given us ideas. They've helped us shape the show in a different and improved way.
And Super Context tries to give back to that community with rewards through our Patreon program. So if you're a member, you will get access to things like outtakes and blooper reels, also bi-weekly bonus mini episodes of the show, and a extra monthly episode of the show all about Stephen King adaptations. This month, I can't believe I'm going to say this, we're going to do an episode about the Dark Tower movie.
Oh, its magics are stronger than ours.
But one of the things that we do for everybody, unless you ask us not to, is we thank everybody during this spot right here. So let's start by thanking Alex Laird, Ambrose Allen, Amit Doshi, BB Schwells, Bennett Callahan, Beth Barnett, Billy Whitehouse, Brian Chauvinich, and Carolyn Zoids.
And thank you to Chris Marlton, Cliff Landis, Coco, Dave Jordan, Dave Wachter, Eilish Phillips, Elijah Tilstra, Evan Mapstone, Fred Rasco, Ira James Udiskin, Jason Puckett, and Jess Staten.
Thank you also to Jill Kaufman, Joseph Aleo, Junta/Cult, Calvin Ellis, Carmela Padovich, Kate Sharon, Kevin Wetter, Christian Hirvila, Lee Fowler, Liliana Gill, and Lokesh Dakar.
Thank you to Luigi Oswego, Melinda Hale, Miriam Meany, Misha Moon, Nathan Weatherford, Neil G. McGuire, Nick Sage, Patrick Malka, Pete Bowe, Philip, who does have a last name, R.M. Rhodes, and the podcast Rein It In, Matt and Rachel.
And thank you to Rob Sloan, Robert Negoesco, Roman Marichek, Ron Bilodeau, Ross Llewellyn, Ryan O'Neill, Sari Nichols, Simon Workman, Tara Meshach, Thomas Tremberger, Vielheit, and Whitney Buchanan.
If you'd like to join this list of thank yous, find us at patreon.com/supercontext. And we're back. So I am looking at the numbers for Batman Odyssey, the first 6 issues, and they make perfect sense to me. Mm-hmm. The first issue sold almost 63,000 copies.
Yeah. So for context, that's almost double the amount of most comics that we've covered on here. So
that's a high number for a single issue.
Yeah, yeah.
And then it began to drop. 48,000, 40,000, 35,000 for the number 4 issue, 31,000 for the 5th issue. And by the time it got to that first break, the sales were down to under 30,000.
So around where most comic books live.
Yeah, where a solid comic book would sell.
Yeah. So weirdly, I couldn't find numbers for the follow-up series, the Volume 2 series. I don't know how it was released or how it was tracked or whatever, but it jumped from single-issue sales to the collection sales. And the collection sold somewhere between 23,000 copies and, like, on its second or third printing, 18,000 copies. So it did okay. And then they collected everything together into one big hardcover book. That sold a little over 2,000 copies, which is small, but consider that those books are probably like $30 a pop.
These are all respectable numbers for the sales. But it does feel like there was a lot of interest and people just started to peel away.
Yeah. So I would say that happens with every ongoing series. I would say that is probably why they did a volume restart where they put out another issue 1. I think that these numbers show that the audience, the direct market audience, is interested in more superhero content from classic creators like Neal Adams. And so that's why they went out and immediately bought this first issue and then trailed off. We should point out that these numbers are, they don't include the book market, the library market, or the digital market. And they are only reflective of books sold to stores. So we don't know what the actual sell-through rate was.
Yeah, but we do have this piece of information. It has all started again. Neal Adams has been given the go-ahead to do another Batman Odyssey style project. He's doing Batman versus Ra's al Ghul. And it's getting the same kind of attention. It's the same kind of book, but he's doing it.
And I have not read it. My understanding is that this is a tie-in book to a big event storyline that's happening in DC Comics right now. So supposedly it's all in continuity, whatever happens in this.
Well, when I clicked on a review of Batman versus Ra's al Ghul, I was reading the text and I couldn't tell if I had misclicked on a Batman Odyssey review or if I was reading. And there was even a frame up and I thought, oh, I don't remember that one. Oh no, that's the new one. So like it's all Neal Adams, even if the reason for doing it might be now a slightly different reason.
Now, I wanted to present you, the audience, with 2 different review perspectives, kind of give you an idea of how this book was talked about. We've already mentioned Laura Hudson and David Wurlitz's piece, so let's start with them. They say that when they wrote their piece, they were halfway through the tale of Batman Odyssey, and they said, "We feel comfortable claiming, without hyperbole, Batman Odyssey is the most insane comic book we have ever read. If there's a comic book equivalent of the hilariously nuts cult film The Room, it's surely Batman Odyssey, a miniseries," and then they go on to explain it. Okay.
Yeah. They say things like,
yeah.
Laura, I've read every issue of this comic no less than 3 times, and I can't give you an overview of the plot. Joking around again with that quote from Neal Adams. As far as I can tell, there are at least 3 separate plots within the book itself, I think. And Laura says to that, I'd also like to say before we go any further that for this reason and many others, I do actually love this book. I hope it never stops. And I know from reading that also he says, me too. I love it. So they are constantly saying this book is difficult, insane, weird. I don't know why he did it this way, but they're also surrounding it with this kind of gleeful enjoyment of what they're describing as crazy confusion.
This is where Laura Hudson points out, really, if you look at it without reading the words and you just look at the pictures, it's good because Adams is still, quote, a great artist who understands visual storytelling. And David Worlitz goes on to say, Adams undermines his own gifts as an artistic storyteller with all of the unnecessary narration that goes on within the book. Perhaps it's a meta thing happening here. You and I mentioned this as well. But the confusion is essential for us to understand what Batman's state of mind is like as everything unfolds around him.
Now, Neal Adams had some things to say about the way the book was being reviewed. I remember we talked about he had a lot of quotes where he would say, it's a book, you got to read the whole thing. And then he even said, I can only hope you read the whole 13 issues and agree that I have brought us all to the next step up. If I have, all of comics is going to get much more interesting. I'll tell you this, every single point will pay off, even if you didn't understand why I did it at first. So he is very clear about, I think these reviews are stopping people from getting the whole thing. You got to read the whole thing to get what I'm trying to do.
Even more than that, he, in some interviews, claimed that retailers were reducing their orders of the book because of reviews like the one that was in Comics Alliance, because people were calling it insane and making fun of it. Yeah. He said, well, that's why it's not selling as well as it should, because they're not putting as many copies on the shelves.
Now, there were folks who reviewed it and said it's great. Mm-hmm. And in fact, there were people who wrote introductions or blurbs for the comic book that spoke well of it.
Yeah, one of those was a guy named Pete Stone, who wrote the introduction to the hardcover. We're not going to read the whole thing here, but Stone does essentially what we're doing here. He puts it in context, and he's like, look, like when this came out, people were kind of thrown off by it, but it is great, is what he says. Let's see where we can capture that.
It's hard to find a bad page. New ideas, new characters, new worlds to explore. We, the people working around Neal every day, had to admit it. He's still got it. No, that's not fair. He's actually gotten better. Much, much better. There will be critics, but there always are. This is not the Batman of old. He's young and brilliant. He's the Batman who can beat anyone in the DC universe, face any problem, survive any death trap. As a fan, you might disagree with Neal's interpretation of Bruce Wayne. But read it. All of it. Twice, 3 times. Then and only then will you understand this epic story. So even this, supporter and colleague of Neal Adams says in his, glowing review, you might not like it. There are problems in it that might make you feel like you shouldn't read it. Yeah. But please do read it. Like there's inherent in that praise is also a listen, keep going, even if you want to stop.
And I think I might be going too far here, but bear with me. I think that this is illustrative of a conflict that's going on, not in comics, but in superhero comics fandom. The people who buy and read superhero comics every week. That there is one faction, call them whatever you like, that want comics to stay the same way as they have, but they're people who are our age in their 30s or 40s or 50s who are reading comics and want them to read the same way that they read when they were kids. And then there are people who want comic storytelling to be more modernized, to be more streamlined, to reflect the world that we live in now. And so I think Batman Odyssey is this kind of like interesting tug of war going on between those two communities. And the numbers show you like there is a strong group within comics readership that wants something like this.
Yeah. And it's interesting that Neal Adams, despite kind of, in a way, seeming like a blustery, prideful creator, was like, hey, don't judge my work until you read the whole thing.
Right.
He also is very thoughtful about comics. And he says a version of what you just said. Well, not a version of what you just said, but I think he tries to diagnose why there is a kind of resistant nostalgia. Mm-hmm. He says, I think the role of comic books is to be the adults while we're being children. We have to look to our children, at our children growing up and what kind of world they're going to be in, and try to reproduce that world in the art that we do so that the world will get there. If we don't show some of that world, then our kids will never get there. We're so close to the ground level with comic books that we're actually having an effect. Now, he was part of the team that created John Stewart, the African-American Green Lantern. Mm-hmm. He says that he's gotten credit, very emotional credit for having introduced that character. And inside what he just said is this wonderful thing. Like, you boil that down and he says, look, you can't just do the same thing you used to do. You've got to connect with the contemporary world in order for comics to operate the way they do. You can't have the surface be the same if you want the core to be the same.
Yeah. So all of that was his response to a question about race and social issues. The interviewer says, you approach race and social issues a fair amount in your work. You don't pull comics punches. So what should comics' role be? And he responded with that quote that we just gave. There were no pieces where folks talked about how representation and diversity were handled in here. Neal Adams, despite having worked on Jon Stewart and, he was the artist on the infamous, you might not know about this, Charlie, but the infamous Green Arrow story where Green Arrow's sidekick turns out to be a heroin junkie.
I saw the cover for that.
Yeah. So
while doing the research for this, which was shocking.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's what he's associated with. But when we step back and we think about this comic, how does it handle representation and diversity? Okay, so we know the guy who is mainly writing it and drawing it is a baby boomer, white, straight family man, but he is trying to cover issues of diversity in the world as he sees them.
Yeah, I think it reflects what we see a lot with older folks who are good-hearted and self-aware without really being able to empathize or let go of their framework.
Yeah.
Like he can say you can't force your vision of what was important to you as a youth on other people. But also he just wrote this kind of whitewashed comic, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting comic, right? Especially when you consider that almost all the characters he's using are pre-established, big name characters. Everybody's white except for the villains. Raish, Talia, and I guess the Sensei, who are all related to each other, I think are some mixed blend of Asian ancestry. It's never been made clear what that is.
And there is that weird thing that as there are revelations of who is actually on whose side, certain superficial characteristics that relate to that Asian mix fall away.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit creepy, but it's not explicit enough to be like, oh, what the fuck are you talking about? But there's a little bit of, as they take off their costume, they reveal that they're more on Batman's side and they're more part of the team. And the team seems to be middle-aged or getting older white people. Yeah.
I would say that the Sensei at some points in this is a borderline Yellow Peril style character. In some ways he's not, in some ways he is. It's a little weird. I don't know if Adams was commenting on that or not, but it stuck out to me. The stuff with the people who live in the Hollow Earth was real weird, representation-wise.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of conversation about their genetic lineage, and that apparently the quote humans who live under there are Neanderthal descendants, and so they're darker skinned and they have thicker foreheads, and they talk a lot about their physical features. But then there's another separate race of people that are descended from velociraptors.
Yeah, there's dinosaurs that have evolved into human-like people.
And sometimes he draws them and they just look like people, and they might have a tail.
And sometimes
other times he draws them and they're horrifying.
They have that face, and the teeth.
Yeah.
And, it's so not unreal because like it's drawn like real stuff. It's so I'm gonna have to say it. It's so kooky. It's hard to make some connection to an actual worldview. You know, it's
Sure,
like
yeah.
you can't say, oh well, this horrible allegory is, you know, this race and that race, or
It's a little bit like saying George Lucas is using, I don't know, the Gungans to represent African Americans or something. Yeah.
Yeah, you can certainly make a case, a superficial case, but also it's incoherent enough that it doesn't actually seem to be a racial statement.
Yeah, right. Yeah. If this has anything going for it, it's that its incoherence keeps it from being overtly racist.
Okay, let's try and there's a moral to his story. Let's try to get to it.
Yeah, and we said, like, I know we might not be doing that great of a job, everybody, but we're trying to take him seriously here. We're trying to take him at his word. What was he trying to do? And then what was the effect? And was he successful?
And it seems to have a lot to do with violence and the ubiquity of violence and how old responses to violence or crime are no longer useful.
Right. I think when I read this, and then subsequently when I read interviews with him, it made me think this is a man who, like us, is reading the news or watching the news every day and seeing gun violence and is horrified by it. I think Neal Adams is fairly progressive in his own way politically. And so he's really grappling with, like, what has my generation left the world with in terms of, like, how we've handled guns? Well, my way of understanding the world has been through Batman. So I'm going to try to understand guns through Batman, and guns are in fact fairly important to the story of Batman.
Yeah, and in Batman Odyssey, there's even discussions of, like, Robin says, "Oh wow, holding this gun actually makes me feel kind of powerful and good." Right. And Batman says, "Yeah, that's the problem." Like, there are these moments of, like, really direct and interesting sort of semi-interrogation of the comics and of the past tropes, the past assumptions in these comics.
Yeah. I guess this is a little bit of a spoiler for the storyline, but, like, you know, the story begins with Batman recounting his first night out and how he brought guns with him and how he got shot and what it was like getting shot, what it felt like, and how that changed how he approached his vigilantism.
And I do want to correct you just a little bit. It begins with Batman telling a story about him and Robin in the cave, where he tells Robin about his first night out.
Yeah, and we should mention...
It immediately gets confusing.
At the meta level of him telling the story, he is not wearing a shirt. He is a bare-chested, hairy Bruce Wayne. Now,
okay,
the story ends with him pretending to murder the villain with a gun.
In front of all the other villains.
Yeah.
So that they get the shit scared out of them and stop acting like he's a ineffective crime fighter.
Yeah, and after he faux murders this guy, he says to them, he's like, look, like, the game's over, you know, new rules from now on. If any civilians are harmed or any law enforcement officials are harmed by you during your shenanigans, I will straight up kill you. And they're all like, oh, holy shit. And then we go back to the Batcave, and, like, the reveal is he didn't actually kill the guy.
Yeah. And so there's this kind of, what was the point, right? Was it that violence, the idea of violence, is the only thing that will keep people in line? But if so, there's also this core of Batman is not a killer. Batman doesn't use guns. So is he pretending as a noble thing? Is he pretending as a last-ditch effort? And the book itself has this kind of kinetic, hyper sort of rendition of violence and emotions and plans, and it's everything is overdone, including the things the characters do in order to affect change.
Yeah, so I found a piece that I think speaks to this. It's from a blog written by a comics reader named James Romberger. And he was trying to understand himself how Neal Adams approaches violence in his storytelling, specifically because Odyssey threw him off so much.
Yeah.
And he points out, he says, look, like, to understand Neal Adams, you have to remember in the 70s, realism, comprehensive draftsmanship, and hyperkinetic storytelling, that all of this were part of what marked him as being such a potent force in comic books. This is what he's celebrated for. This is what he knows. And at the time, it seemed like he was, quote, poised to do something substantial in comics, something that would put all of his skills together in a complete and meaningful statement. And then Romberger says, instead of doing that, he ran Continuity Studios for years. He ran this really successful advertising agency.
Yeah, and did the occasional sort of anti-visual comic, where it's like a book written into the speech bubbles of a very simple comic book.
So then Romberger goes to Batman Odyssey and he says, maybe this is Adams' attempt at finally making that complete and meaningful statement where all of his skills come together. And he says, when you look at this book, it's elaborately drawn, but it's also really ultra-violent in its depictions of over-the-top, quote, violations of bodily surface and splattering blood. And that's true. In all of the fights in this, like, people's teeth are getting knocked out, their fingers are getting broken and bent back, there's blood spraying all over the place. It's not the usually, cauterized version of violence that you find in superhero comics.
It's almost like a 3D movie. There's lots of framings that aim towards the audience. And he goes on to say, in the comics of Neal Adams, Batman Odyssey and around it, I see heroes spitting blood from between teeth so clenched that they might shatter from the pressure. Muscles and veins popping. Imminent cardiac arrest. I see men tied to chairs, tortured gleefully, bullets ripping through flesh, and exploding heads. The images are linked to superheroes, a genre still considered to be in the realm of children, in that the majority of the population would think that a superhero comic would be okay for a child to look at. In that context, Adams' images are disturbing.
So Romberger went down to a comic book convention where Adams was set up with his big booth that I described earlier. And he straight up asked him, he said, look, you're the premier uber-American superhero artist. Do you feel that you're representing what he refers to as, quote, the Guantanamo-id of violence and torture in superhero comics? He calls it, he says, the Saw franchise mentality that has become so prevalent in America now.
Almost like the version of comic book violence that connects to the escalating construction violence in superhero movies. First you knock down a building, then you knock down a town, then you blow up the seaboard, and then you blow up the earth, right? He's saying there's all this violence. What are you trying to say, Neal? Why are you going so extreme on the violence? And Romberger sums it up by saying, Neal Adams told me that much of his work was about the repercussions of violence, and that the hyper-realistic depictions, the sort of over-the-top rendering of violence, was to make it feel like violence, not comic book plotting.
Yeah, and he steps back and he talks specifically about stuff in Odyssey. So I mentioned the first issue, Batman gets shot in the arm. That's the cover of the book. We didn't even mention, like, the covers of these are essentially like the last panel of the issue before them. Sort of like they don't operate as covers. They operate as like transitions between the issues.
It's wild. It's like commercial breaks when you read the collected story. So it's like here's the panel, and then there's the back matter, and then previously on Batman Odyssey.
Yeah. So this cover shows Batman getting shot. I don't know if I'd say it's gory, but Adams said, he was inspired to write that because his father was in the military and he got shot in the arm the same way.
That's a bullet going through the forearm and coming out the other side. So the classic, just a flesh wound, but it's a lot of damage, and it's drawn like a cylinder of fire going through the arm.
Yeah, I mean, I should also point out, like, most of the drawing books that I have on my shelves here that are like how to draw comics use Neal Adams as like the platonic ideal of anatomy for superhero comics. So this is like, I think, very intentional in how he's drawing a bullet, rending its way through flesh.
Yeah.
He also talks about the part that you mentioned, that Robin gets this fetishistic pleasure from holding a gun, and that's creepy.
And Batman in Batman Odyssey talks Robin through that and explains the rationale behind being a superhero who deals with people who have guns but doesn't use a gun himself.
Yeah.
So there's gun control. There's this anti-violence, this sort of scared straight kind of anti-violence idea in the comic. And Romberger says that sequence about the guns, about holding the gun and Batman getting shot and all that, makes sense to me now. I still have some problems. Any intended examination of gun control in Batman is counteracted by the prevalence of typical comics imagery of cool money shots of dudes, including Batman, shooting guns. At best, the comic is sending a mixed message. So this is Romberger basically saying there is a core, there's a point that Neal Adams is trying to get at.
Yeah, and in a way, depending on where you fall on this issue politically, it's admirable, right? Like, he's looking at the world and he's saying, like, oh, this is a thing I'm concerned about, and I have this power through storytelling. Maybe I should try to use that to address this thing I'm concerned about in the real world.
But then Romberger says, I feel like the superficial qualities of the art, of the story, and I say superficial meaning the imagery, right? Yeah. And the well-done pages seem to push against the point that Neal Adams wrote into the story.
Yeah. So, all right, let's step back for a second, and then we'll try to unpack the whole thing. All right. So what we're talking about here is a comic book series created by an older guy who is considered a master, and then he put it out there in the world, and a lot of people made fun of him for it. And they said, "This is crazy. I can't believe this guy thinks
you're a nutbag. None of this makes any sense. And why would you do this?"
Yeah. But when you step back and you look at the whole, how the gears work in this whole thing, he had good intentions.
He had a very distinct purpose at each moment.
Yeah, right, which he outlines. He says, like, my goal is to, like, figure out these things about Batman and commentary about gun violence and to tie up these things. At the same time, you're also dealing with a tremendous ego. Like, that he himself would admit to, I think, that is, it seems to be unfettered by the company that owns the character. I don't think there was a whole lot of editorial action going on here. And so you get to this situation where this is, I hate to use this, but at the same time it's kind of fun. This is an okay boomer moment.
Okay. So explain why, if okay boomer sort of sums up the reaction somebody has to an older person suggesting that the way they figured things out is still important, and in fact more important than what the youth is trying to figure out. Yeah. The response is, okay, boomer. And that could be anything from aesthetics all the way up to policy, right?
It feels like most of the response to this is like, yeah, all right, like, we recognize that you're doing that over there, but it's not particularly helpful. So, we get it. And I turn to another piece on Adams, written by a person named Michael Dooley, who says this is another way to understand Adams and how he approached it. Adams has always been unapologetically proud of his, quote, bad boy of comics reputation, where he rushes into topics where others would fear to tread during a career that spans more than half a century. So...
And those topics are some of the stuff you mentioned. Yeah. Heroin addiction, attempted suicide. He references Nazis and the Vietnam War in superhero comics in the 70s. So there's a certain amount of, in Neal Adams' sense of himself, and also in the way that he is critically understood, that he could deal with stuff that some people could not in a medium that was understood as kind of less than adult at the time that he was doing it.
He was more mature than his contemporaries and more talented than his contemporaries, and therefore it was almost incumbent upon him to tell a story like this because no one else would.
And then he made Batman Odyssey, where he did do one part of that. I mean, talking about gun control or gun violence and the repercussions of violence and the way that a person like Batman or a nation like America might try to deal with terrorism, right? Because that's what the costumed crazies are in Arkham. They are terrorists, right, who go out and try and make a spectacle to control people's actions as opposed to just, violence and thievery.
They're not just robbing banks. Yeah.
Right. He goes after that, but he does it like he used to. Mm-hmm. And that diminishes his point, especially when he didn't get someone who can write dialogue to script his dialogue within his story, and he ended up sort of showing off all of his untrained writing abilities.
Yeah. And then there are these two quotes from Adams that I think really perfectly sums all this up and how he came to this point, right? Because in a lot of ways it seems like he's not self-aware while he's doing all these things. And I would argue, I think he is. First of all, he says, when I do conventions, fans treat me like I'm something, and they get flustered and they get sweaty. It's the same thing they do with the actors that are at these shows.
The movie stars.
Yeah. When I go on the street, nobody knows who I am. So I have the best of all possible worlds, because who the hell wants that?
Who wants to be attacked on the street by fandom?
So he's conscious of the fact that he's a person who's had, this is an unceremonious way to say it, but smoke blown up his ass for 50 years. And that he, while it is nice, it's not something he wants all the time. And
let's also give him his due. Yes, he's been flattered by fans, but also he has been critically appreciated. Right, his gifts have been assessed, and he's been given an understanding of his work as important. And yet he also likes that all of the flattery is contained in certain environments.
But then he says this in this interview. Look, I've made so many mistakes. There's not just one that I can point to. I've made tons and tons of mistakes. I've done stupid things and ridiculous things. Usually what I do is I make stories out of them. When I do something really stupid, I say to my family, okay, remember this. Because whenever anybody says, your father's a genius, remember, your father's a fucking idiot. Remember that. So he's spelling out right there. He's saying, all these people are constantly telling me I'm the best thing in the world. I'm a genius, but I'm constantly fucking it up. But nobody really seems to see it except for like my family, which is this very close unit. They run a business together.
Yeah. So he's able to recognize that he's putting on a show at the conventions, right? He's playing the character of Neal Adams.
Yeah.
He's enjoying himself in interviews and all that. And when he then does something that a lot of people think is ludicrous and completely a mistake, that reveals him to be a fucking idiot, you can actually track down his purposes, his drive, and you can find at least some semblance of humility when it comes to the work. It's just completely hidden by this batshit insane comic.
You've been listening to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How it's made and how it informs our everyday culture.
Our theme music is Human Factor by Mile Marker.
And right now you're listening to Drive Fast by 3 Chain Links.
Show notes and all our past episodes are available at supercontextpodcast.libsyn.com.
You can email the show at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com to tell us what you like, what you don't like, and to suggest topics for future shows.
And I'm available on Twitter as @Christian Sager.
And I'm there @Bennett Radio. 2 N's, 2 T's.